As we previously discussed at the weekend on the, in fact, well, just a couple of days ago, we discussed about the possibility, of course, of there potentially being a trade war between the UK and the EU. Now, of course, this will be incredibly damaging for the UK. As in any trade war, it is the bigger market that has all the advantages. And we are a junior partner in this current, shall we say, relationship. And we ain't got any power here. But why is this being pursued? Why are we hearing talks about it? Well, it is because, again, the Brexit ultras or the Brexit absolutists are absolutely determined that a trade war is the only way that Britain can now truly break its chains from the EU, and that they believe that under a trade war, we will somehow once again, you may have seen very recently that there are once again talks about getting a US trade deal, and of course joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though I know no, that's not his name anymore, but again, it's the CPTPP. But Trans-Pacific Partnership is probably the simpler name for it. But yeah, that's their bizarre belief. And should that happen, if a trade war does happen, one of the things that the EU could very do as its nuclear option is it could just go, okay, we're trading on WTO terms. And a lot of Brexiteers have hailed the WTO as being the only true way to trade. However, they have never ever explained what the WTO is, how its rules work, and the fact that the World Trade Organization just doesn't really have any power. It is, of course, the libertarian dream. It's an organization that only has as much power as countries decide to let it. Essentially, it's a court with no teeth, and if it does rule in trade negotiations, countries may necessarily not even have to follow its rules or even rulings. Perfect for the libertarian fantasist dreams out there. So let's get into what the WTO is, and of course, its many, shall we say, toothless rules. So let's dive into this then, shall we? But before we do that, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And also down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel that way. So on with the article. This comes from the Yorkshire Bylines with the title, The World Trade Organization and Its Rules. So, during the debates on Britain's post-Brexit trade, much was made of the term WTO rules, as if there was a body which could act as an alternative to the EU's trade rules. The simple basic fact about the WTO is it can only have as much power and influence as its member states allow it to have. So, what is the WTO? The WTO is best understood as an international forum that sets the framework from which its member states, currently 164, agree to trade. The WTO sets a minimum baseline based on the principle of liberal free trade and does not act as an enforcer of law like a police agency. If any countries feels discriminated against by another country's trade practice, it can bring a case to the WTO's dispute settlement procedure. If the claim is adjudged unfair, a successful claimant can take the regulatory countermeasures. This dispute settlement procedure was established at the founding of the summit of the WTO back in 1996. So why was the WTO established? The WTO was established at the Marrakesh summit of 123 nations back in 1996 as the culmination of a very long evolution of the idea that world trade needed an agreed international legal basis. It was the somewhat belated child or even belated grandchild of a post-World War II settlement under which the auspices of the Bretton Woods system, which sought to establish stability in the world's capitalist economies and avoid the interwar years' social, economic, and political collapses. So, what was the plan for creating stability? Fiscal stability was to be secured by the International Monetary Fund, and the economic recovery and development would be fostered by, of course, the World Bank. And a third pillar was to be established to guarantee the stability in trade to avoid repeating the downward spiral of the 1930s of the politics of trade protection, where countries tried in vain to isolate themselves from worldwide shocks. A positive international trade organization was signed up to by 56 countries in Havana back in 1948, but it soon ran aground when the US Congress refused to submit to the Senate for ratification. So why did the US oppose it to begin with? Well, there were two reasons. The first was, of course, the USA's very long-standing hostility to the idea that international law should apply to the USA itself. This is known as extraterritoriality, which still remains a problem for the USA. Indeed, opposition to the idea that an international body should have jurisdiction over national law formed the basis for the Brexit revolt here in the UK. Secondly, the USA emerged as the world's leading economy and military power, and had every confidence that it would dominate the world's economy outside of the Soviet bloc, and therefore saw no need to make concessions to an international control of trade. So how did the world begin to move towards this? Through the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Again, remember, you've heard this term before, being brought up by the Brexiteers. This was proposed at the same post-war conference and a less successful international trade organization, which was signed up to back in 1948 by 23 countries, including the US and the UK. GATT followed a trade agenda set over a number of summits to steadily reduce the numbers of hindrances to liberal trade. However, by the 1990s, there was a growing consensus that globalization of the world economy demanded a far more structured and institutionalized set of rules and regulations. This led to the founding in 1995 of the WTO, the intergovernmental organization with headquarters staff operating under the umbrella of the GATT rule system. So was the USA on board at this point? Indeed. The key turning point was the conversion of the USA of the idea to manage trade that it had blocked in the 1940s. Faced with growing competition from the EU, Japan, and the, quote, Asian tigers, President Bush, senior at the time, sent his trade chief and negotiator off with a symbolic crowbar to try and prise open the markets for US exports. The attempt to try and developing countries on the board, the dispute mechanism was introduced, which seemed to offer a method whereby any country could challenge the world trade being dominated by major trading nations. However, the USA still believed that it could use the WTO's dispute procedures as a kind of litigation process to break open protectionist markets in the interest of its own multinationals. So, was the USA allowed to exploit the WTOs in its own way? Developing nations led by India did cut off some of the dangers by preventing attempts to allow private firms to use this dispute procedure to further their own ambitions through litigation. Only sovereign states and entities like the EU could bring cases to the WTO. This happened most notoriously when the USA, acting through the surrogate Central American states, broke open the EU's banana regime, which offered protection to mainly Caribbean banana growers. However, the WTO itself responded to demands from developing countries to institute a regime far more accommodating to their needs and started the so-called Doer development round. Again, it's all very interesting. So, sensing the power slipping away from this, the USA multinational business lobby started to then finally block any progress toward the WTO actually becoming allowed to set up a more equitable binding trading rules. The WTO has subsequently trimmed its own ambitions and settled for being used as a forum of trade negotiations, a kind of GATT plus. So what's the UK's position post-Brexit? The UK was a founding member of GATT, and its separate representation continued into the era of Britain's membership of the EU and the WTO. Though UK trade was conducted within the framework of the EU trade law, Britain always kept a very watchful eye over its own presence at the Geneva, where the WTO is located. This presence has since been beefed up post-Brexit. Trade remains one of the more arcane areas of politics, and in this country, it is very scarcely accountable to democratic oversight and scrutiny. Now that Britain is now trading alone, we should try and emulate the practices of other major traders and entities. One simple mechanism is adopted by the European Parliament, which is the introducing of an annual report on the actions undertaken at the WTO to Parliament, which could be an excellent, though modest, starting point. Given all the promises that we made about global Britain and the opening up of the exciting free trade opportunities, a second welcome step would be to make this a public document. It does not seem unreasonable to be expected to be able to scrutinise and comment on negotiations and agreements that are concluded on our behalf. After all, our future depends on success as a trading nation, and the WTO will continue to be at the heart of this. So that's essentially the WTO in a nutshell. And I think, again, going forward, it's going to be very, very, shall we say, you will need to know about this, because I highly suspect that a lot of the Brexit ultras are going to start heavily pushing for trade wars. You're going to hear the WTO come up a lot more. You probably hear the term GATT come up, as you did back in like 2019, and its clauses like GATT Article B and GATT Article C, which the Brexiteers love to quote Article B, but not Article C. Again, we went over that back at the time, but yeah. Expect that conversation to be very, very quickly, shall we say, rehashed again. So, as always, thank you very much for joining us today. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, as well as the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all